My name is Terri Redpath, and I'm a lecturer at Deakin University in Australia and also a PhD student at the Australian National University. My supervisor is Professor Diana Davis. This paper is signposting some of the themes that emerged from a study I did on the listening behaviour of 52 Australian students. It examined their attitudes to course delivery and interrogated the assumption that their students' social listening practices and preferences translated to their educational contexts. Data were collected using an online survey and phenomenologically oriented interviews, and the data clearly demonstrate that the centrality of listening in students' lives and the multiple ways in which they negotiate the boundaries between listening for leisure and for learning were quite different than what I had anticipated. The expectation, for example, that these tech-savvy students would shun traditional lecture attendance in favour of increasingly available online learning was not substantiated. In fact, their perceptions are of other utilities available in the face-to-face lecture context. The students' voices revealed individual listening attitudes that suggest a research focus on the nature of listening in contemporary higher education is highly likely to have profound implications for the delivery of courses and the design of successful e-learning platforms. Conventionally, there's been a continuing dominance of reading and writing in literacy research and pedagogy in Australia, and more recently, this has included a prevalence of notions of multiliteracies like an umbrella over the four silos of reading, writing, speaking and listening. In this research context, there's been a rapid and pervasive communication change evident that's been linked to digital affordances, and it's seen conflated visual and verbal communication take centre stage. When asking what it's like to communicate in the 21st century and observing the effects of multimodality on listeners within their socio-cultural context, it's worth noting that for decades there have been studies that have demonstrated that listening is the dominant communication mode, even though research and practice have persistently focused on reading and writing, the communicative skills least used. For example, in 1998, Luke and Elkins defined the task facing literacy educators as understanding how new and old technologies would place new demands on and create new opportunities for those of us teaching literacy, and they asked what it would be like to experience literacy as a reader and writer in the 21st century. I felt it was surely equally crucial to ask what it would be like to be a 21st century listener, and thus there was a rationale for this pilot study in 2010. Traditionally, listening research focused upon measuring student listening in some way, and many listeners have been surveyed in regard to the amount of time they spent listening, and there's been research done into valid testing materials to measure their listening aptitude, and also looking at the effects of listening intervention strategies in higher education contexts. Until very recently, listening research in the field of higher education has predominantly been seen as a standalone literacy skill, with little reference to the effects on listeners of multimodality. Clearly, it's relevant to try to find out how and how well students are listening in mediated listening contexts. For example, they are now making meaning via email, via instant messaging, in asynchronous and synchronous conversations that coexist, in telephone conversations and face-to-face communication, all of these things that have affected listening and listeners. And mobile internet use has gone from niche to mainstream, and handheld devices are fast becoming the primary way that students communicate. This was true in 2010, and it's even more so now in 2012, where booming smartphone and tablet use has blurred traditional communication lines. The significant thing here is that the listening behaviour associated with this is as yet not well understood. It's clearly multimodal and it's clearly different to non-mediated listening. After initially investigating the communication practices of the group of higher education students during their final year of teacher education, the research is now taking a longitudinal approach, looking at them 1 year later and beyond as they transition to teaching. The approach being used now is to explore holistically various listening situations in their everyday lives. In 2010, the research questions centred on how contemporary higher education students listened and how updated knowledge of contemporary higher students' listening behaviour could inform the design and delivery of courses. Now we're looking at the impact on their communication. This avatar appeared in my inbox during 2010 while I was conducting my research. And to me it sums up exactly what I was talking about in terms of the importance of the visual-verbal nexus. The student created an avatar for himself and one for me, and we had a conversation via Extra Normal, and in it he requested an extension and I acquiesced and told him to run along and get on with the essay. Now, there was none of the normal formal writing and reading. There was nothing face-to-face about it. And yet we had communicated. It was done tongue-in-cheek, and it was very effective. In the pilot study, baseline data were collected via an online survey that was analysed by a commercial instrument and through interviews from those from within the survey participants who opted in. The data took a mixed methods approach, and it was designed initially to update research about listening behaviour that was particularly likely to inform pedagogical directions, and also to update what were called time studies into listening that had collected data about the proportion of time spent listening rather than on other literacy modes. Reading time, for example, included print-based reading in traditional formats such as newspapers, novels, etc., as well as online reading modes such as iBooks and IM chat, texts and social networking, and the writing categories included lecture notes, essays, etc., but also email, SMS, instant messaging, social networking. And by adding a multitasking category, participants were able to record behaviours that took place in tandem with writing and reading. Their speaking was contextualised so that time speaking to friends, family, at work, in the community and at university classes was shown, as well as any computer-assisted time spent talking and multitasking. The listening data also included face-to-face and contextualised situations, and music was included as both a standalone category as well as within the category where listening and multitasking were recorded. This slide, which was from the survey data showing the comparison between listening and the other traditional literacy modes, indicates the continuation of the domination of listening in estimations of time, but it also shows the contexts in which listening occurred and the degree to which listening and multitasking took place in the students' lives. Really interesting data emerged about the nature of the students' meaning making. And by including descriptors and examples of contemporary communication behaviour within each communication area, data were collected that gave far more detailed information about the nature of communication time via categories that hadn't been relevant in time studies conducted prior to the burgeoning influence of the internet. When data were displayed as an average, as was the case in previous time studies, so much of the complexity and diversity that was evident in individual chart response choices was not shown. Certainly, it still showed that listening remained the dominant communication mode, as in previous time studies, but the degree of multitasking that spans all modes was what stood out as significant. And overall, there was an ongoing dominance of listening in communication together with speaking, and this affirmed trends that were outlined in previous research, while at the same time revealing the nature of listening in a way that was new and certainly had more complexity. Now, this was shown in some of the interview question responses to the question, do you think of texting as reading, writing, speaking or listening? One respondent said, oh, it's reading and writing definitely, but you just don't have expressions or your tone of voice. Whereas another said, it's technically reading and writing, but it feels more like speaking and listening. And another said, it's definitely talking and listening, but just much more efficient. What is signalled is a significant shift in the nature of the way meaning is made that cannot be easily defined by the old categories linked to literacy, those of reading, writing, listening and speaking, because things have morphed and taken on different formats according to their context and according to the individuals using them. This is an interesting slide, given the prevalence that's emerging for massive open courses that are conducted online or through approaches such as the Khan Academy that use audiovisual materials to get the content in, while the students then turn up to class after they've listened, after they've viewed the videos, etc. These students very, very clearly preferred to learn by going to face-to-face lectures. And this was something I hadn't anticipated, this preference for a traditional listening dense form of teaching and learning. And it was a temptation at first to see it as an overwhelming preference, where the empty vessels, the students would listen passively and be filled with knowledge provided by their lecturer. And the survey results certainly provided information on one level that called into question the well-publicised view that these students had a low tolerance for lectures, apparently. But when you conducted the interviews, you got a very, very different picture. For example, the narrative data captured individual explanations and clarified a diversity in attitudes behind this seemingly clear result. Certainly they felt that it was a way to get information quickly, that they didn't like certain forms of lectures where there were just slides that they could have read at home, but some of them felt a compulsion to be there because sitting there made them listen. It was like taking a dose of medicine, which they may choose not to take if left to their own devices. There was the qualitative data that introduced individual and often contradictory listening-related caveats about lectures. The students tended to say that they'd learn if they were engaged. They preferred a face-to-face lecture, but only if it was what they considered a good one. And it was this engagement that was what they demanded, as well as quick access to information that was relevant. And they all tended to want things done in an interactive way. So what might a new communication paradigm look like? While Calantzis and Cope argue that an expansion of modes needs to be considered in understanding what it now means to be literate, what we are arguing is that it's the visual and verbal that need to emerge as dominant, and within this we're calling on listening to be acknowledged as the pivotal communication conduit. Thank you.